The biggest supply disaster the enemy suffered in early 1968 didn't come from a battle. It came from a soldier who got lost. That disaster happened because American intelligence was looking in the wrong places. Commanders believed enemy supply depots had already been found, mapped, or destroyed. They were wrong. The largest cache in the region was hidden in terrain, officially classified as empty. It stayed hidden not because it was well protected, but because no one expected it to be there. The person who discovered it was not trained to find anything. He was 19. He was a cook. He carried no maps, no radio, and no authority. After a supply convoy was ambushed, he became lost in the jungle. What he saw contradicted everything American commanders believed about the area. When he reported it, the discovery was nearly dismissed, not because it lacked detail, but because it came from the least credible source imaginable. Days later, when a major offensive began, enemy forces arrived without the ammunition they were supposed to have. Only then did the scale of the mistake become clear. This is the story of how one wrong assumption, exposed by one lost soldier, quietly altered the outcome of an entire campaign. By early January 1968, American commanders in the Central Highlands were confident about one thing. They believed they understood the enemy's logistics. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough. Maps were filled with patrol routes. Recon flights had passed overhead again and again. Search and destroy operations had swept the same valleys multiple times. Intelligence reports showed no permanent enemy presence in several sectors west of Firebase Susan. On paper, those areas were considered clean. If not or for, that assumption shaped everything that followed. In Vietnam, territory was never truly controlled, but it could be categorized. High-priority zones received constant surveillance. Medium-risk areas were patrolled on rotation. Low-priority sectors, dense jungle with no visible infrastructure, were deprioritized. The sector in question fell squarely into that last category. It had no roads worth bombing, no villages large enough to matter, no radio intercepts suggesting command activity. Previous patrols had found nothing but abandoned trails and temporary camps. To intelligence officers juggling dozens of threats, this made sense. The enemy moved constantly. Caches were small. Depots were assumed to be mobile or dispersed. Large, fixed ammunition complexes were considered too risky, too vulnerable, too obvious. So when recon teams passed over that region and saw nothing unusual, the conclusion was simple. There was nothing there. This belief was reinforced by numbers. Throughout late 1967, U.S. forces in the Central Highlands reported repeated contacts with enemy units, ambushes, probing attacks, short engagements, but almost no recovered supply caches. Enemy units would strike, withdraw, and vanish back into the jungle. Commanders interpreted this as proof that logistics were decentralized and hard to hit, not concentrated and hidden. The war, they believed, was being fought by ghosts. By December, intelligence estimates concluded that less than 20% of enemy supplies in the region were being interdicted. The remaining 80% simply disappeared into terrain that resisted surveillance. But this failure produced a dangerous side effect. It created a false sense of certainty. If large supply depots existed, commanders reasoned, they would have been found by now. If they hadn't been found, they likely didn't exist. That logic hardened into doctrine. Patrols were redirected. Recon priorities shifted. Assets were allocated elsewhere. And the sector west of Firebase Susan quietly slipped off the list of places worth worrying about. This is how blind spots form in war. Not through ignorance, but through confidence. By January 1968, American forces were preparing for something bigger. Intercepted radio traffic suggested unusual enemy movement. Captured documents hinted at coordinated action. Prisoners spoke of an upcoming offensive, though details were vague. Commanders knew an attack was coming. They just didn't know where it would hit hardest. And without clear knowledge of enemy supply locations, there was little they could do to stop it. They reinforced defensive positions, stockpiled ammunition, prepared artillery fire plans. What they did not do was revisit assumptions already marked as resolved. He started. No one went back to question whether an area declared empty might still matter. Because in war, time is limited, and certainty, even false certainty, feels efficient. This was the mental framework in place on the morning of January 17th. A system built on patrol reports, reconnaissance passes, and probability estimates. A system confident that if something important existed, it would already be known. That confidence is why the next event almost failed to register. When a report finally came in describing a large enemy presence in a supposedly empty sector, it didn't trigger alarm. It triggered skepticism. The system was prepared to receive intelligence from scouts, officers, and recon teams. It was not prepared to hear it from someone who had no reason to be there at all. Because in that system, credibility mattered more than content. And the person about to challenge everything American intelligence believed about that sector had none. He wasn't trained to observe enemy movement. He wasn't qualified to estimate troop strength. He wasn't authorized to assess logistics. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to leave the firebase that morning. The only reason he entered that empty jungle at all was because a routine supply mission went wrong. And that mistake would force the system to confront a reality it had already decided did not exist. If the intelligence system had a blind spot, James Castellano was standing directly inside it. He was not part of any plan. He was not assigned to reconnaissance. He did not appear on any operations board. At 19 years old, Castellano occupied the safest corner of the war as it existed on paper. He was a mess hall cook. His job was logistics, in its most mundane form: hot meals, inventory lists, powdered milk, scrambled eggs, coffee brewed before dawn. He had arrived in Vietnam barely 3 months earlier and had chosen food service for one reason. It seemed survivable. Castellano had grown up in Queens, New York, in his father's small Italian restaurant. By the time he was a teenager, he knew how to work a line, prep for a rush, and clean a kitchen at closing. When the Army recruiter offered food service as an option, it felt logical. Cooking was familiar. Infantry was not. His older brother had already done 2 tours and returned with scars no one talked about. Castellano wanted to do his time, keep his head down, and go home. That decision placed him exactly where the system expected him to be: behind sandbags, inside the wire, far from the jungle where intelligence failed. At Firebase Susan, his days followed a strict rhythm. Wake before sunrise. Start the coffee. Prep breakfast for hundreds of men who would soon step outside the perimeter. Lunch was often rations. Dinner mattered more. Hot food, when available, was one of the few comforts the base could offer. Mortar fire came occasionally at night, but rarely with effect. To Castellano, the firebase felt insulated from the war. That illusion was about to collapse. In mid-January 1968, commanders grew increasingly uneasy. Intercepts suggested something large was building. Enemy activity was rising. Patrols reported contact more frequently, but without results. The enemy struck and vanished. Morale dipped. In response, a small decision was made, one that seemed trivial at the time. Hot meals would be delivered forward. Not to fight the war. Not to gather intelligence. Simply to boost spirits. 3 food service personnel were assigned to the detail. Castellano was one of them. On the morning of January 17th, 2 trucks left Firebase Susan. One carried supplies. The other carried insulated containers filled with eggs, bacon, and coffee. Castellano rode in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. He wore a flak jacket that didn't fit correctly and a helmet that kept slipping over his eyes. His rifle rested awkwardly between his knees. He had fired it exactly 3 times since entering the army. The road was narrow, muddy, and lined with dense jungle. It was considered low risk. Adotta, Fertisu, the ambush began. The first sound didn't register as gunfire. It was sharp, metallic, wrong. Then the windshield cracked. The driver slammed the accelerator. The truck fishtailed. In less than 3 seconds, everything changed. The passenger door wasn't latched. Castellano felt the vehicle tilt, and then he was airborne, tumbling into elephant grass taller than a man. When he hit the ground, the air left his lungs. By the time he could see clearly, the trucks were gone. Engine noise faded into the distance, chased by sporadic rifle fire. Then silence. Castellano lay motionless, surrounded by vegetation so thick it blocked the sky. He waited. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like an hour. When nothing happened, he moved. He found his rifle. His helmet was gone. He had 2 magazines, 1 canteen, and no idea where he was. The road lay 10 meters away. Returning to it meant exposure. He chose the only option that felt safer, moving away from the road, deeper into the jungle. This was not a tactical decision. It was instinct. For the next 2 hours, Castellano walked. The jungle closed around him. The canopy blocked the sun. The undergrowth fought every step. Every direction looked the same. By the time he realized he was lost, it was already too late to correct. And then he heard voices. Vietnamese. He froze, dropped low. Through a gap in the vegetation, he saw them. Dozens of soldiers. Weapons stacked. Wooden crates being unloaded. Camouflage netting stretched between trees. Bunkers. Not temporary positions. Permanent ones. Castellano did not understand what he was seeing in strategic terms. He only understood one thing. This was not supposed to be here. The sector had been labeled empty. No American patrols operated this deep. No maps marked anything of value. Yet in front of him was a complex large enough to supply far more than a patrol or a squad. He watched for several minutes, barely breathing. Then he withdrew, slowly, carefully. What he did next would later be remembered as instinct, but at the time it was desperation. He climbed a tree. The trunk was tall and rough. His arms shook. His palms tore. At the top, the canopy broke open. Sunlight flooded in. And, for the first time in hours, Castellano could see. Firebase Susan lay in the distance. Radio antennas, tin roofs, perimeter wire. He memorized the landmarks and climbed back down. The return took hours. When Castellano finally approached the firebase, he did so with his hands raised, terrified of being mistaken for the enemy. Inside the wire, soldiers stared. The convoy had reported him missing. They assumed he was dead. When he began describing what he had seen, reactions hardened quickly. A cook, lost in the jungle, claiming to have found a major enemy installation. Skepticism came easily. In the intelligence system, credibility mattered, training mattered, authority mattered. Castellano had none of those. His report contradicted maps. It contradicted patrol results. It contradicted assumptions that had already been accepted as fact. So the system did what systems do when confronted by inconvenient information. It minimized. It reframed. It prepared to dismiss. What Castellano did not know, and could not know, was that his accidental discovery had just placed him at the center of a contradiction the war could no longer ignore. Because, if he was right, then everything American intelligence believed about that sector was wrong, and the only thing more dangerous than not seeing the enemy was believing you already had. Castellano expected relief when he crossed back inside the wire. Instead, he walked straight into disbelief. The first reaction was procedural. His name was logged. His status was updated, from missing to recovered. A medic checked him for injuries. Then came the questions. Where exactly had he gone? How far from the road? How long had he been alone? When he began describing what he had seen, the tone shifted. Not alarm, not urgency, skepticism. The sergeant of the guard listened for less than a minute before cutting him off. A large enemy position? In that sector? Patrols had swept the area weeks earlier. Recon flights had passed overhead. Nothing had been reported. Castellano tried to be precise. He described the number of soldiers, the stacked weapons, the wooden crates, the camouflage netting stretched between trees. He explained that these were not temporary positions. The response was immediate. Stress does strange things to perception. Fear exaggerates. Untrained observers misjudge scale. The sergeant nodded politely and ended the conversation. Castellano did not leave. He insisted on speaking to intelligence. That insistence was the first thing that kept the discovery alive. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, Captain Richard Byrne, the battalion intelligence officer, looked up from patrol reports as Castellano entered. Byrne had heard this story before. Nervous privates, misidentified camps, ordinary jungle activity mistaken for something larger. He let Castellano speak. Then he pulled out a map. The area Castellano pointed to had already been cleared. Multiple times. Byrne explained this patiently. If a fixed installation existed there, someone would have seen it. A patrol would have found it. Recon would have flagged it. Castellano repeated what he saw. Byrne responded with probabilities. The jungle played tricks on depth perception. A small cache could look massive under stress. A squad, unloading supplies, could appear larger than it was. Castellano's certainty only deepened Byrne's doubt. Confidence, from an untrained source, was not reassuring. It was suspicious. Around the room, others weighed in. Someone mentioned casualties taken in that sector weeks earlier. If a large depot existed, the enemy would have relocated it by now. Another added that ammunition was moved constantly. There was no reason to fixate on one report. The discussion began to drift. Byrne turned back toward his paperwork. The system was doing what it was designed to do, filtering noise. Then Colonel Thomas Henderson walked in. He had not been summoned. He had heard raised voices from the doorway. Byrne explained quickly. A lost cook claimed he had discovered a major enemy installation. Probably nothing. Henderson looked at Castellano. Not briefly, not dismissively. He asked one question. How sure are you? Castellano did not hesitate. 100%, sir. That answer mattered, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. Castellano had not embellished. He had not escalated his claim over time. He had described the same details, the same numbers, the same layout, every time. Henderson knew how fear sounded. This was not it. He also knew how systems failed. They failed by trusting their own assumptions too much. Henderson made a decision that, on paper, cost almost nothing. Request a reconnaissance flight. One pass. If nothing was there, the matter would end. Byrne objected mildly. Recon assets were already stretched. False alarms were common. Henderson overruled him. If the sector was empty, confirmation would cost an hour. If it wasn't, ignoring it would cost far more. The order went out. At 14:20 hours, an observation aircraft lifted off. The pilot was experienced. He had flown countless reconnaissance missions over the Central Highlands. He did not expect to find anything. On the first pass, he saw nothing. Dense jungle, unbroken canopy. Exactly what intelligence reports predicted. On the second pass, he dropped lower, risking small arms fire. That was when the observer noticed something wrong. Not movement. Geometry. Straight lines where nature made curves. Shadows that didn't match the sun. Camouflage netting just slightly off in color. On the third pass, they dropped again. Through a break in the canopy, they saw it. Bunkers, multiple structures, and a soldier looking up. The radio crackled. Positive identification. Multiple camouflage structures. Estimated platoon strength presence or greater. Back at Firebase Susan, the room went silent. The impossible had become real. Maps were wrong. Patrol reports were incomplete. The sector marked as empty was anything but. Henderson acted immediately. Artillery fire missions were plotted but held. He did not want to warn the enemy. Air assets were requested. 7th Air Force confirmed availability. The timeline accelerated. Castellano stood against the wall. Forgotten. No one spoke to him. No one apologized. The system had moved past doubt and into execution. What mattered now was not how the discovery had been made, only that it had been confirmed. At 15:45 hours, fighter bombers launched. By 16:03, they were on station. White phosphorus marked the target. Clearance was given. The bombs fell. From the fire base, soldiers watched smoke rise. Then fire. Then something no one expected. Secondary explosions. Massive. Sustained. The jungle began to erupt from the inside. What had been hidden for months or longer was detonating all at once. Ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction beyond any prediction. The explosions lasted minutes. When they stopped, there was nothing left. The depot had ceased to exist. In the hours that followed, intelligence officers reviewed imagery. Crater dimensions were measured. Damage estimates were revised upward again and again. The installation was far larger than initially believed. It had not been a minor cache. It had been a logistical hub. And it had been missed because no one believed such a thing could exist there. That realization came too late to matter in theory, but just in time to matter in practice. Because the enemy offensive everyone had been waiting for was already moving. And now, something critical was missing. The system had almost ignored the discovery. Not because it was implausible, but because it came from the wrong person. A cook. lost, untrained, standing in the wrong place. That nearly cost hundreds of lives, and it revealed a flaw far more dangerous than any hidden bunker. The belief that information is only valuable when it comes from someone authorized to see it. For the next several days, nothing appeared to change. The jungle was quiet again. Patrols continued. The firebase returned to routine. On the surface, the strike looked like a successful but isolated event. Another cache destroyed in a war filled with them. But beneath that calm, something fundamental had shifted. American intelligence officers began to notice it almost immediately. Intercepted radio traffic changed tone. Enemy units that normally moved aggressively slowed down. Reports mentioned ammunition discipline, an unusual phrase in this theater. For months, American units in the Central Highlands had faced attacks supported by what felt like unlimited firepower. Rockets, mortars, sustained automatic weapons fire. Enemy forces would probe, withdraw, and return again and again. Now, those patterns began to break. 9 days after the airstrike, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The Tet Offensive began. Across South Vietnam, coordinated attacks erupted in cities, bases, and outposts. The scale was unprecedented, and in Kon Tum province, the Central Highlands became one of the focal points. Firebase Susan was hit hard. A battalion-level enemy force attacked from multiple directions, probing the perimeter, attempting to overwhelm defenses. But something was different. Instead of prolonged rocket barrages, only a limited number of rockets struck the base. Instead of sustained suppressive fire, attacks came in shorter bursts. Enemy units advanced cautiously, conserving ammunition rather than overwhelming positions. American defenders noticed it immediately. This was not how previous assaults had unfolded. Fire missions were called in. Artillery responded. The perimeter held. After 6 hours of fighting, the enemy withdrew. When the smoke cleared, casualty reports told an unexpected story. American losses were significant, but far lower than anticipated given the size of the attack. Enemy casualties were high. More importantly, captured documents recovered in the following days confirmed what commanders had begun to suspect. Enemy units were short on ammunition. One field order, dated January 28th, complained directly about supply shortages. It referenced the destruction of a major supply depot, identified by location. The same location Castellano had stumbled into by accident. The order instructed units to limit fire, avoid prolonged engagements, and prioritize withdrawal over sustained assault. This was not improvisation. It was adjustment. The enemy had planned for something they no longer had. In after-action reports, American intelligence officers reached a conclusion that would not be widely discussed at the time. The destruction of the ammunition complex had directly degraded enemy combat effectiveness during the opening phase of Tet. Attacks that were meant to be overwhelming became manageable. Positions that might have fallen held. Estimates varied, but the numbers converged around the same conclusion. Hundreds of American casualties did not occur, not because of superior tactics, not because of better leadership, but because the enemy arrived without the ammunition they expected to use. This was the moment when the true scale of the discovery became clear. The depot destroyed on January 17th had not been a local cache. It had been a logistical hub, a supply point feeding multiple units operating across the region. Its location deep in jungle, away from roads, in an area considered empty had allowed it to function undisturbed. And its destruction had created a ripple effect far beyond its physical footprint. For years, American commanders had struggled to strike enemy logistics. The jungle protected supply lines. Terrain defeated surveillance. Assumptions filled the gaps. This time, the strike landed not because intelligence worked, but because it failed in a way that allowed chance to intervene. The irony was difficult to ignore. One of the most effective logistical blows of the war did not come from months of planning. It came from a mistake. A door left unlatched. A truck swerving under fire. A cook falling into terrain no one was paying attention to anymore. And the system almost discarded the result. Only after Tet did the broader implications sink in. Analysts began re-examining assumptions about fixed installations. Training materials were updated. Guidance circulated, emphasizing that actionable intelligence could come from any source, not just scouts. not just officers, not just trained observers, but from anyone who happened to see what the system was blind to. Castellano himself did not experience this shift as a triumph. In the days following the battle, he returned to his assigned duties. There were no celebrations, no immediate recognition. The war moved on. When formal commendation finally came weeks later, it was brief. A medal, a handshake, a citation read aloud and forgotten. What lingered was something else. The understanding that the war had come dangerously close to missing a decisive opportunity, not because of enemy deception, but because of institutional confidence. The belief that what had not been found did not exist. The belief that information only mattered if it came from the right person. That belief had nearly allowed the enemy to strike at full strength. Instead, they arrived constrained. And for once, that constraint mattered. The destruction of the ammunition depot did not win the war. It did not end Tet, but it altered its opening hours in one region in a way that saved lives, quietly, indirectly, almost invisibly, and it forced American commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous enemy advantage was not hidden in the jungle. It was embedded in their own assumptions. For everyone else at Firebase, Susan, the war moved on. Patrol schedules resumed. Defensive positions were repaired. New intelligence estimates replaced the old ones. For James Castellano, nothing returned to normal. On paper, his role in the events of January 17th was complete. The discovery had been confirmed. The depot destroyed. The offensive blunted. There was nothing more for him to do. And yet, everything had changed. Castellano went back to the mess hall. He cooked the same meals, cleaned the same equipment, worked the same hours, but the jungle no longer felt distant. Before, the war had been something that happened outside the wire. Now, it followed him inside. He slept poorly. When he closed his eyes, he heard voices in the trees. Vietnamese words he did not understand, but could not forget. He replayed the moment of the ambush again and again. The sound of gunfire, the truck swerving. The instant he realized the door wasn't latched. In every version of the memory, there was a moment where he froze. That detail mattered to him. Others talked about courage. Castellano remembered paralysis. No training, no instinct to react, just fear. The system did not see that part of the story. In official accounts, Castellano was calm, observant, decisive. Those words fit reports better than reality. They fit a narrative where outcomes mattered more than experience. Inside the firebase, reactions to him shifted subtly. Some soldiers treated him with respect, others avoided him. A few joked about it, calling him Recon Cook, or the guy who blew up the jungle. It's scowled of go. Castellano laughed along when required. But he did not see himself that way. He had not chosen to discover anything. He had stumbled into it. And in the process, people he never saw had died. That thought stayed with him. The war has a way of assigning meaning after the fact. Commanders talk about decisions. Analysts talk about effects. The individuals caught in between are left to reconcile outcomes with intention. Castellano struggled with that gap. He knew the strike had saved lives. He also knew it had ended others. Those facts existed together, and there was no clean way to separate them. Weeks later, the recognition arrived. A bronze star with V device. A citation read aloud in formal language. Meritorious service. Wanted. Exceptional initiative. So it being direct contribution to mission success. I have do well. A general shook his hand. Photographs were taken. The ceremony lasted minutes. Then it was over. The general moved on to the next briefing. Castellano returned to the kitchen. He did not keep the medal with him. He did not talk about it. When asked, he minimized what had happened. He said he got lucky. That phrase became his default explanation. Luck required no interpretation, no responsibility. It allowed him to distance himself from consequences. As months passed, the immediate attention faded. New operations replaced old ones. Castellano completed his tour and rotated home in mid-1968. Queens looked unchanged. The restaurant smelled the same. The war receded into something distant, unreal. Castellano worked in the kitchen. He married. He raised children. He lived a life that had nothing to do with reconnaissance or intelligence failures. When people asked about Vietnam, he deflected. He spoke about cooking, about work, about normal things. Decades later, a historian called. The historian had found Castellano's name in declassified intelligence reports. The file described the ammunition depot, the strike, the impact on Tet. The historian wanted confirmation. Castellano agreed to one conversation. During that call, he was asked how he felt about the medal. His answer was blunt. "I fell out of a truck and got lucky," he said that. The historian pressed further. "What about the lives saved? What about the operational impact?" Castellano paused. Then he said something that never appeared in official records. "I didn't do anything special. I just said what I saw. The rest wasn't up to me." Well, buy-ins. That statement captured something the reports never could. The system needed heroes to justify outcomes. Castellano did not need that explanation. For him, the war was defined by accidents and consequences. By being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place, depending on who was counting. When Castellano died in 2011, his funeral was modest. Neighbors attended. Former customers from the restaurant came. 3 men stood apart from the rest. Vietnam veterans. They wore their VFW uniforms. One of them wrote a note in the memorial book. "Because of you, we came home." Ardu. Castellano's family found the note later. They did not know who wrote it. They never met the man. But the message carried a weight the medal never had, because it acknowledged something official history often avoids, that wars are not changed only by strategy. They are changed by moments when reality collides with assumption, and by people who never intended to matter, but did. From the outside, the lesson seemed obvious. A critical enemy supply hub had gone undetected. It was discovered by accident. When destroyed, it measurably altered the course of a major engagement. The conclusion appeared simple. American intelligence needed to listen more carefully, but that was not the lesson the system absorbed. In the weeks following Tet, reports circulated. Guidance was updated. Training materials were adjusted. Officers were reminded that actionable intelligence could come from unexpected sources. On paper, the lesson was acknowledged. In practice, very little changed, because the problem exposed by Castellano's discovery was not procedural. It was structural. Military intelligence is designed to reduce chaos. It prioritizes trained observers, verified channels, and repeatable methods. This makes sense. Wars generate enormous amounts of noise. Without filters, systems collapse under their own data. But filters have a cost. They determine not only what is heard, but what is ignored. In Vietnam, that cost was magnified by terrain. The jungle defeated visibility. Technology struggled. Reconnaissance returned. Probabilities, not certainty. To compensate, the system leaned harder on assumptions. If an area had been swept, it was treated as resolved. If nothing had been found, nothing was expected. That mindset created efficiency. It also created blind spots. Castellano's discovery did not reveal a new enemy tactic. The North Vietnamese had always relied on concealment. What it revealed was something more uncomfortable, that the American system had begun to trust its own conclusions more than reality. When information arrived that contradicted those conclusions, the instinct was not curiosity. It was resistance. Not because anyone was malicious, but because accepting the report meant admitting something fundamental, that the system could be wrong, and not wrong in detail, wrong in structure. The Cook's report did not fit the model, so the model tried to reject it. Only one decision prevented that from happening. A colonel choosing to spend an hour verifying something that shouldn't exist. Well, I was for did. That choice mattered, but it was not institutional. It was personal. And personal decisions are not lessons systems reliably learn. After Vietnam, military doctrine evolved. Technology improved. Sensors multiplied. Satellites replaced observation aircraft. The belief took hold that future wars would be different. That blind spots like this belonged to an earlier era. They did not. Every modern conflict produces its own version of the same error. Information that does not fit expectation is discounted. Reports from unconventional sources are treated as unreliable. Absence of evidence is mistaken for evidence of absence. The pattern repeats. Because systems are built to confirm what they already believe. Castellano's story endures not because of what he found, but because of how close the system came to ignoring it. Had the report arrived from anyone else, a scout, a patrol leader, be a reconnaissance unit, it would have been treated differently. Not because the content would have changed, but because credibility would have. That distinction matters. Wars are not lost because of missing information. They are lost because information is filtered through belief. The most dangerous blind spot is not hidden terrain. It is confidence. The belief that what has not been seen does not exist. The belief that the enemy must conform to expectations. The belief that if something mattered, someone qualified would have found it already. That belief nearly allowed a major enemy offensive to strike at full strength. It was interrupted only by chance. A loose door. A wrong turn. A person in the wrong place. Those are not reliable safeguards. They are warnings. Castellano never asked to teach a lesson. He did not want to expose a flaw in military intelligence. He wanted to survive a supply run. But his experience forced the system to confront a truth it preferred not to examine. That the enemy's greatest protection was not camouflage. It was assumption. And that assumption did not disappear with the end of the war. It followed doctrine. It followed technology. It followed confidence into every conflict that came after. The war did not want to learn that lesson. Because learning it meant accepting uncertainty as permanent. Accepting that no system, no matter how advanced, sees everything. Accepting that sometimes the most important information arrives without credentials, and that ignoring it carries a cost measured in lives. That is the real legacy of what happened in the jungle west of Firebase Susan. Not the explosion, not the medal, but the reminder that the difference between disaster and survival can hinge on whether a system is willing to listen to the least expected voice in the room. Years later, the jungle reclaimed everything. Firebase Susan was dismantled. The wire came down. The bunkers were filled in. The clearing where the ammunition depot once stood vanished beneath new growth. The crater disappeared. No marker remained. If you stood there today, there would be no evidence that anything important had ever happened. That, in a way, is fitting, because the most significant part of this story was never the explosion. It was what came before it. The belief that nothing important existed there at all. James Castellano did not think of himself as someone who changed the war. He rejected the idea whenever it surfaced. He said he fell out of a truck. He said he got lucky. He said anyone else would have done the same thing. Those statements were true. They were also incomplete. What Castellano actually did was something far more uncomfortable. He exposed a blind spot, not by intention, not by skill, but by simply being present where the system was no longer looking. That blind spot had been created slowly, by reports that seemed consistent, by patrols that found nothing, by reconnaissance that returned silence. Over time, silence became certainty, and certainty became doctrine. Once that happened, the most dangerous assumption in war took hold. If something mattered, someone qualified would have found it already. That assumption nearly allowed a major offensive to strike at full strength. It was interrupted not by planning, but by chance, a mistake, a wrong turn, a person who did not belong in the equation. The system did not like that outcome. Systems rarely do. They prefer lessons that reinforce structure, not challenge it. So the story was filed away as an exception, a rare case, an anomaly, something interesting, but not foundational. The broader lesson that confidence can be more dangerous than ignorance was quietly set aside, because accepting it would have required admitting something unsettling, that even the most sophisticated systems can miss what is directly in front of them. That expertise can narrow vision instead of expanding it. That information does not become true because of who delivers it. It becomes true because it matches reality. That tension did not end in Vietnam. It resurfaced in later conflicts. In different terrain, with better technology, the tools changed. The blind spots did not. Every war produces moments where reports arrive from unexpected sources. Local civilians, support personnel, occidental observers. Often, those reports are filtered out. Not because they are wrong, but because they do not fit the model. That is the quiet danger Castellano's story reveals. Not the danger of enemy deception, but the danger of self-assurance. The belief that a system already understands the battlefield well enough. James Castellano lived the rest of his life far from that battlefield. He worked in a restaurant, raised a family, rarely spoke about Vietnam. To most people who knew him, he was not a soldier. He was a cook. Only a few men understood what his accidental discovery had meant. They were the ones who stood at his funeral decades later. They wore uniforms from a war that had ended long ago. They did not talk about intelligence failures or logistical models. They left a note. "Because of you, we came home." That sentence captures the truth better than any report. Wars are not changed only by strategy. They are changed by moments when assumptions collide with reality, and by whether a system is willing to listen when that happens. The enemy lost ammunition in early 1968, but the more important loss belonged to certainty. The belief that everything important had already been seen. That belief did not survive the jungle west of Firebase Susan, and it remains one of the most fragile assumptions any war can make. Sometimes, the difference between disaster and survival is not preparation, or intelligence, or technology. It is whether someone notices what everyone else has already decided cannot exist, and whether anyone is willing to believe them